So today we start Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. You need to definitely read the introduction to Boethius in the Penguin Classics version and or translation by Victor Watts. It's really good. It gives you a lot of pertinent information and background. And he also references a lot of other texts that can help elucidate. What I'm going to attempt to do is I'm going to begin with just a very, very brief overview, kind of a summary of each of the 5 books, just a few minutes each. And then we'll jump into the first book. I'll be honest, I don't know how long this lecture is going to take. It may end up being more than one lecture. It may end up being a separate lecture over each of the 5 books, depending on how much I get into each of the books. Probably you've noticed after reading this, it is not at all like reading the Greek plays or Homer's Odyssey. This requires much more thought to understand, to follow. It is really pure philosophy. And 21st century audiences / students are not very adept, let's say, at reading philosophy. The summary for Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, I'm ripping off. I'm taking this almost straight from the edition of the Consolation by P.G. Walsh. And this is in the Oxford World Classics. So, book 1. Philosophy, the goddess philosophy, comes and helps to identify Boethius's ailment. And his ailment is not being in prison. His ailment is not being charged with a capital crime, and his ailment is not the fact that he's going to be executed probably within a year of writing this. His ailment is, as Walsh puts it, that, quote, blinded by vicious emotions, he has forgotten how the world is ordered. That is, he's forgotten how the world works, okay? And so she says, we'll start with a gentle cure. So she has to get him to be unblinded, right? Book 2. Boethius blames fortune for all of his problems. And Walsh says, quote, Lady Philosophy denounces the prisoner's bitter indictment of fortune against whom he has no real complaint, right? Unquote. And so fortune is invoked, literally. They call out fortune, and fortune, speaks on her behalf. And she essentially says, the whole nature of the game, so to speak, her whole raison d'etre is inconstancy. Fortune always changes. So you can't blame me if, one day you're up and the next day you're down, essentially, right? Quoting Walsh again, philosophy insists that his present life has its material consolations, his riches, his books, etc., etc. Quote, but true happiness is not to be sought in them. Material possessions, material things aren't what provide true happiness. So he's got to learn, where does true happiness reside? Book 3. Okay, notice book 3 is the middle of the entire consolation. Okay, so before telling him where true happiness is found, she goes and talks about, she being Lady Philosophy, goes on and talks about how, quote, the quest for riches, high position, and fame, and additionally physical pleasure are defective ways of seeking the true good. Okay? In other words, put that in kind of more modern language, we modern people, all people really, think happiness is to be found in wealth, clothing, dress, food, sensual pleasures, power, prestige, honor, all those kinds of things. Philosophy in book 3 says no. The true way to happiness is to go back to our beginnings. Okay? It doesn't mean to go back to the womb. It doesn't mean to go back to your family name. It means to go back to why was humanity created in the first place. Okay? And in the middle of book 9, philosophy turns from condemning all these false goods, material possessions and such, to the true good, which she says is God. In fact, she says goodness resides in God, right? And if you want to be truly happy, you go back to God, okay? Walsh puts it this way. Perfect good resides in God, who is identical with happiness. The defective goods sought by men must be merged into the unity of the one and the good, which we must seek by introspection, for the truth lies within us. All things in the world are ordered by that highest good, unquote. Right? So we have to turn inwards rather than outwards. And you'll notice throughout literature, when people do turn inwardly, that's when they find solace. That's when they find peace. If they look for solace and peace and happiness outwardly, they tend not to find it. Okay? That's why the line in the film Jerry Maguire, uttered by I think it's Renee Zellweger. It might be Tom Cruise's character. It's been so long since I've seen that movie. The line, you complete me. No, that's not true. Because that implies happiness is only found in another person. Well, every other person, I've been married 35 years. Every other person is going to fail you at some point. Okay? Yes, I'm not saying that you cannot be happy with another person, but that other person here, this realm, doesn't complete you. If we had read St. Augustine's Confessions or his City of God, St. Augustine says, we only find our completion in God, right? Book 4. So, Walsh says, having established the identity of God as the true good, Lady Philosophy now investigates whether he apportions justice in the world, okay? And Boethius kind of responds and says, well, it's obvious that he doesn't because, to quote the Billy Joel song, the good die young. Or the book of Ecclesiastes, why do the wicked prosper and the good seem not to? Okay? And she argues, Lady Philosophy argues, well, that's not true. The good receive more good by being good, okay? And the wicked become more wicked. And her argument is by becoming more wicked, they become more inhuman. They become less than human. Whereas the good become more human and become more like the source of all good. That is, they're drawn upwards, whereas the wicked are drawn downwards. Okay? So Walsh says, quote, while good men become divine, evil men are turned into animals. The perpetrator of crime is thus deserving of pity. He should be made to recognize his punishment as remedial, unquote. Okay? But Boethius still says, yeah, but the world doesn't seem to work according to some plan, okay? Walsh puts it this way. The prisoner's Boethius, insists that the apparent irrationality in the ordering of human affairs is at odds with the governance of a good ruler, unquote. Well, what does that really mean? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God allow poverty, suffering, pain, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes? Where is a good God if this world stinks so much? Okay? And philosophy says, all right, we'll take that apart. And she starts to discuss providence, God's governing rule and order of things, and fate and necessity and things like that. Okay? And says, quoting Walsh, man cannot fully comprehend this process and must be content to acknowledge that every fortune visited upon him is good. Notice, every fortune. Now we tend to think just the word fortune means good thing. And so we qualify that by misfortune. And misfortune is a bad thing. Well, what philosophy points out is that's not the case. Everything that occurs to us ultimately is good because it has a purpose. And that purpose is to draw the individual closer and closer and closer and closer to God. Okay? So, book 5. Boethius says, well, is there such a thing as chance? Random occurrence. Makes no sense at all. In philosophy essentially says, no, there's not. Okay? So they then get to the main point of book 5. And I think that really this is the main point, and this is why he ends with this. This is the main point of the entire Consolation, okay? Which is the reconciliation of divine providence, of God's rule of the world with human free will, okay? Philosophy says, according to Walsh, we have to recognize 4 levels of cognition, that is 4 levels of knowing: sensation, imagination, reason, and understanding, right? And Walsh goes on, quote, these correspond with the 4 levels of existence, namely immobile life, that of the lower animals, the human, and the divine. Okay, so back to me. So sensation corresponds to immobile life. The example that's used is like mussels in shellfish, okay? That of the lower animals, imagination. Why? Because it appears that animals, do have some imagination. They make some choices between things, okay? Reason, which is us, humanity, and we'll talk about that when we get there. And then the divine, understanding. That is putting everything together and seeing the why, okay? Walsh says, quote, the reconciliation between providence and free will is achieved at the 4th level of divine understanding. In other words, it's impossible to even attempt to answer the why without becoming more and more and more like God. And you'll notice every time I talk about becoming more and more and more like God, I'm always moving upwards. Why? Because God is higher. Okay? And when she gets to that point of understanding, she draws the distinction because Boethius wants to know, well, how can God foreknow things and I can still have free will? And we've talked about this before. Philosophy says, well, it's a matter of terminology, but really it's a matter of our attempting to understand how God understands, which, notice to begin with, we cannot ever do that. We are finite individuals. We are finite creatures. My brain exists in this cranial cavity. God's does not, if we accept the existence of God, okay? So and even though Boethius doesn't say this emphatically, I'm going to. If we accept the existence of God, we cannot talk about God's foreknowledge. because to God there is no for, all right? There is no before. God is outside of time. For us, it's foreknowledge, because we don't see tomorrow, or the day after that, or next week, or next month, or next year, or the next 1,000 years, right? And the way Lady Philosophy puts that is, for God, time, all of time, is now. It's all present. Everything is present for God. Why? Because he is out of eternal time. He exists beyond time. All right? So that's the brief overview or summary. Now let's get into the book. And one of the reasons this lecture may take the form of several individual lectures is I'm gonna bring in several other works and make links to these other works, because Boethius writes all this stuff, and then writers after him are constantly alluding to some of the same ideas, whether or not those authors are aware that they are doing that. For example, I'm going to bring up J.K. Rowling, first book and the seventh book in the Harry Potter series. I'm not positive that she is aware of the allusions that she is drawing to this book. And if she's not aware, it's because the ideas from the Consolation of Philosophy have so permeated our culture, right, that she's just tapping into them totally unaware. Because she did a major in, I think it was classics and French. She did a double major. I think it was classics and French. I'm pretty positive that she is well aware of the Consolation of Philosophy. She's well aware of medieval literature, for example, okay? And if you're well aware of medieval literature, you have to be well aware of the Consolation of Philosophy, because next to the Bible, it was the most important work for medieval authors. Okay, book one. So just, very, very, very brief background. Why is Boethius writing this? And I've mentioned this before in class. Boethius was very powerful in the court of King Theodoric, who was an Ostrogoth Germanic king who ruled Italy during the very, very late 5th century, 483, something like that, unto just about the first quarter, the end of the first quarter of the 6th century. I think he died in 526, 527, something like that. He died, I think it was about 3 years after Boethius was executed. Okay, he replaced the previous Germanic king. One important thing, Theodoric was an Arian, and we'll talk about the Arian heresy at some point, or I've got to talk about the Arian heresy at some point. Essentially, the Arians did not believe that Christ, Jesus Christ, the man, okay, in his divine nature was the second person of the Trinity, okay? What that means is Arians did not acknowledge the Trinitarian nature of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Arians said, Arius, the founder of the Arians, said that there was a time when the Son was not. There was a time when the Son of God did not exist. He was the first of all created beings, essentially. Okay? There is a council of the church, it's called the First Ecumenical Council in 325, 326, where the Arian controversy was discussed and ruled, okay, that it was a heresy. Little sidebar here. St. Nicholas, the guy upon whom Santa Claus is the legend or myth of Santa Claus ultimately comes from, St. Nicholas attended that council. He was real, okay? And he punched Arius, decked him, was thrown in prison. And while he was in prison, Emperor Constantine had a vision that said, you better let him go because he was defending me, Christ, right? And he lets him go, and St. Nicholas goes back to the conference. So Arius gets anathematized. He gets condemned. He's not condemned to be murdered or anything like that. But his heresy, his acknowledgement, his statement, I should say, that the Son of God is not the same as God, is declared a heresy. And one of the things that comes out of that council is the Nicene Creed, which gets added to later, but part of the creed is that Christ is of one essence with the Father, right? Very God of very God, consubstantial, that is of the same essence, of the same stuff as God, okay? Later on, the Holy Spirit gets added into that. So you have Father, Son, Holy Spirit, same essence, same substance, okay? Three persons. Person of the Father, person of the Son, person of the Spirit. You have the Father, who is the Godhead. The Son proceeds from the Father eternally. He is eternally begotten of the Father, according to the Creed. And the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Son. The Holy Spirit is sent by the Son, okay? So, Boethius gets imprisoned because someone, a secretary to the king named Cyprian, tells the king that Boethius is essentially plotting against him, okay? Boethius claims his innocence. He's sent to prison. He's denied access to his family. He's got two sons who have been made consuls, one consul in essentially Rome, one consul in essentially Constantinople. They're very powerful. They're very young. They're teenagers when that occurs. His father-in-law is a very, very well-known, very wealthy, very well-educated person. So is his wife, etc. And Boethius gets, charged with this capital crime, and probably from what it appears, Theodoric forces the Senate to find him guilty, okay? And according to the one document that actually survives that tells us how he dies, he has a cord, like a rope, wrapped around his head, around his forehead, and it's tightened. And it's tightened until his eyes pop out. And then he's beaten to death. So he doesn't die from that. It's excruciatingly painful. He dies from being bludgeoned to death, okay? So he's in prison, and he's essentially asking, why me, God? Why is this happening to me, okay? He's devoted his life to knowledge. He stated as a goal that he was going to translate all of the works of Aristotle and Plato into Latin so that people could read them in Latin, okay? It's clear he's a Christian. He is a right-believing Christian. He's not an Arian or anything like that. He writes works about the Trinity. He writes works about the catechism, about the Catholic faith. Catholic here meaning universal, the faith believed by all real/true Christians. Okay. So the book begins with this poem, and you're going to notice that these poems come throughout. Okay. And in book one, the poem is at the beginning of the book, and then you have the book divided like into chapters. So you have the poem comes at the beginning of book one, at the beginning of the first chapter. Beginning of book two, you've got a poem, then the prose material. But when you get to book two, it starts with the prose material, and it concludes with the poem. And then in chapter two of book two, It starts with the prose and ends with the poem. And it goes that way all throughout the rest of the book. Okay? Not exactly sure why there's that change, but part of it, I think, is because in when we get to book 2, we kind of leave the easy stuff behind. I mean, not totally. Philosophy is going to say essentially that the first couple of books are the easy medicine. When we get into book 3, it gets a little harder. We get into book 4, it's, it really drops in terms of the depth. It gets much, much, much more difficult to follow and to understand, right? So in that first poem in book 1, towards the end of it, about 6 lines up, we read, this is Boethius speaking. While with success false fortune favored me, 1 hour of sadness could not have thrown me down. While with success false fortune favored me. Okay? He's saying, while I enjoyed success in life, 1 hour of sadness couldn't have thrown me down. Thrown me down there means knocked me off my feet. It couldn't have knocked my legs out from under me, right? But notice how he calls that false fortune. He's saying the success, it wasn't real. And then he says, while I was quietly thinking these, it goes to the prose, while I was quietly thinking these thoughts over to myself and giving vent to my sorrow with the help of my pen. So he's thinking about this and he's starting to write it down. Well, when he says that while I was quietly thinking about this, that's very similar to Shakespeare's Sonnet 30. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my time's dear waste. Okay? So there's this pattern of, when bad things start to happen, you sit down, you slow down, and you calmly try to think things through. Why is this happening? It's interesting, I hadn't considered it before. In the Old English epic poem Beowulf, when the dragon comes, in the final half of the poem, third, when the dragon comes, we're told Beowulf immediately thinks he's done something wrong. And he tries to understand how it is or what it is he's done that has offended God. Okay? So he's thinking about this and he becomes aware that there's a woman standing over him. Okay? He gives the description of her. She shoos the muses of poetry away, calls them sluts and stuff, whores, I think it is. And, says, the muses of poetry, page 4, towards the bottom of the page, I'm quoting now from the Watts edition that we used in class, they habituate men to their sickness of mind instead of curing them. In other words, they make us accept what's going on around us. They make us say, oh, this is natural to us, rather than curing the sickness of mind. She's saying the problem is not the external events that are happening, it's my response to it. Okay? It's how Boethius responds to what is happening to him. Right? So she shoos them away. Chapter 2 starts with the poem. And the poem says, so sinks the mind in deep despair and sight grows dim. Notice, as the mind sinks into despair, sight does what? It gets clouded. Well, what is despair? It literally means lack of hope. What's the image we often use to describe someone who is suicidal? It's like they're in a tunnel with no light at the end. Okay? There's no hope. Well, notice the other part of that. Sight grows dim. If you're in a tunnel and there's no light, you can't see. You're blind. When storms of life inflate the weight of earthly care, the mind forgets its inward light and turns in trust to the dark without. The mind forgets that there's light in here. Okay? That is, the hope is in here. It's not out there. So instead, it turns in trust. It turns trusting to things out here that it can grasp on. Right? And then the poem speaks to talking about Boethius. This is philosophy speaking. This was a man who once was free to climb the sky with zeal devout, to contemplate the crimson sun, etc., etc., and instead is now suffering. Again, last 5 lines of the poem, page 6. Now see that mind that searched and made all nature's hidden secrets clear, lie prostrate, prisoner of night. Well, why was that mind, Boethius's, searching and made all nature's hidden secrets clear? Because he used to be, prior to his imprisonment, philosophy is saying, a servant/student of philosophy. He sought out the hidden meaning of things. He sought out wisdom. He sought out light. He sought enlightenment. Okay? Now, he's seeking answers out in the world of sensation, intangible things. And so instead, she says, rather than rising, he lies prostrate. It's like he's chained onto something. Okay? Hold on a second. Let me pause for a minute. So she tells him in the prose that follows that poem, middle of that first paragraph, I gave you arms to protect you and keep your strength unimpaired, but you threw them away. The arms she's talking about, the ideas, the philosophy. Okay? She says, you recognize me, right? And he doesn't answer. So she gently puts her hand on his breast, meaning she puts her hand on his chest and says, it's nothing serious, only a touch of amnesia that he is suffering, the common disease of deluded minds. Right? What is amnesia? When somebody doesn't know who they are, right? Notice, it's the common disease of deluded. What's the lewd in there? Enlightened. It's delightened minds. It's darkened minds. Darkened minds don't know who or what they are. He has forgotten for a while who he is, but he will soon remember once he has recognized me. Can you think of a film from the last 30 years that has this idea, in it? The Lion King. I know, it seems trite. Simba has that vision. He's off living with Pumbaa and Timon, and he has that vision. The stars, the clouds, and the thing rumbles towards him, and he hears his father's voice. And Mufasa says, you have forgotten who you are, the son of the king. And Simba, wakes up. He remembers. And at the very same time, Rafiki the baboon kind of is enlightened also. Right? He will soon remember once he has recognized me. To make it easier for him, I will wipe a little of the blinding cloud of worldly concern from his eyes. Now, notice, philosophy here isn't berating Boethius. She's saying the problem is you are too overfreighted with worldly problems. You're being borne down by cares and concerns of the world. She says, so I'm going to remove some of those. All right? Chapter 3. The night was put to flight, the poem. The night was put to flight, the darkness fled, and to my eyes their former strength returned. I can see clearly now, as the old song from the 60s says, the rain has gone. All right? End of the poem. Outshines the sun with sudden light suffused and dazzles with its rays the blinking eye. Now that's possibly, an allusion to Plato's allegory of the cave, which we are going to have to talk about, and it's going to take some time. And I've got a drawing I'll screen share, to help explain it a bit. So Boethius then goes on and says, after the poem, in the same way, the clouds of my grief dissolved, and I drank in the light. With my thoughts recollected, I turned to examine the face of my physician. In other words, with the amnesia gone, I kind of, shook clear and looked at the face of my physician. Interestingly, hadn't thought about this before, when I thought of making connections to books, the same kind of thing happens in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Went past it. In the book, The Two Towers, when Gandalf, Legolas, Aragorn, and Gimli go and see Theoden in Meduseld. Okay. Trying to find the exact passage I want. In the chapter The King of the Golden Hall, Gandalf goes in and speaks to Theoden. And we get the description of Theoden as he's an old man and he's leaning forward in his chair. And Worm-tongued, the evil advisor, is on one side of him, and Eowyn, his niece, is standing behind him. And Gandalf speaks words to him and says, your mind isn't as dark as you think. Page 514 in the one-volume edition. Gandalf lifts his staff and he points to a window high in the hall, and a shaft of light comes in. The rest of the hall is like almost pitch black. And Gandalf says, not all is dark. Take courage, Lord of the Mark. Same kind of thing, by the way, Athena keeps saying to Orestes and to Agamemnon, Odysseus. Take courage, Lord of the Mark, for better help you will not find. No counsel have I to give to those that despair. That is, if you don't have any hope, I can't help you. Okay? And he says, I bid you come out before your doors and look abroad. Too long have you sat in shadows. He wants them to come out in the light. So Theoden goes outside, and Gandalf has the doors opened, and Theoden goes out and he looks across his land. And he sees the land, and Tolkien gives us this beautiful description. There's clouds and there's rain. And then we're told, page 515, suddenly through a rent in the clouds, behind them a shaft of sun stabbed down. The falling showers gleamed like silver, and far away the river glittered like a shimmering glass. And Theoden says, it is not so dark here. Okay? He's getting a glimpse of the light. This is a physical image of the glimpse of the light he's getting in his mind. And Gandalf says, no, nor does age lie so heavily on your shoulders as some would have you think. See, the character Wormtongue has planted this idea, you're old, you're infirm, you're weak, so that he now thinks it. And Theoden says, dark have been my dreams of late, but I feel as one new awakened. That's exactly what Boethius is talking about here, okay? And so he turns and looks at philosophy. And she says, I came down from the heights of heaven. Or he asked, why did you come down from the heights of heaven to here? Okay. And she says, why should I desert you? Should I be frightened by being accused or cower in fear as if it were something unprecedented? This is hardly the first time wisdom has been threatened with danger by the forces of evil. She essentially responds, why shouldn't I come down to you? This isn't the first time wisdom, philosophy, has been threatened by anything, okay? So she's saying, why shouldn't I come down and help you? All right? So they keep talking, and she says, you've forgotten some of your previous writers and thinkers and such, page 8. And says, it is hardly surprising if we are driven by the blasts of storms when our chief aim on this sea of life is to displease wicked men. Okay? The chief aim on this sea of life is to displease wicked men. Well, how are you displeased by wicked men? By pointing out their wickedness, or by being good men, by being virtuous men and women, by standing up for what's right, right? Well, that's what got him in this boat. See, one of the things Boethius did was he disagreed with Theodoric. That is, he told Theodoric that the charges against me are wrong and the charges against the Senate are wrong. And so he defended the Senate against what Theodoric thought the Senate was doing. Okay? Chapter 4, the poem. Let men compose themselves and live at peace, set haughty fate beneath their feet, and look unmoved on fortune good and bad, and keep unchanging countenance. Okay? A couple of things there. The word compose, you have to look at the etymology of that. Because we simply think compose, that means to arrange something. Like a composer arranges music. Or you compose a picture, you arrange the elements in the picture. Okay? What it literally means, if you look at its etymology, it means to lay down with. The com, means with, and the pose means to situate, to place, to lie down, to place down. Okay? So let men lay down and live with peace. See, when you lay down, you become vulnerable, right? It means you're not fearing anything, right? And look unmoved, unaffected, unchanged. On what? On good and bad fortune. To look unmoved means to accept it. To say this is how things are, okay? And keep unchanging countenance. That's partly at least, it's the Epicurean idea of moderation in all things. It's the Stoic idea of suffering Hamlet's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, but always remaining on an even keel, not going up and down with the vicissitudes of life, right? Not being bipolar. Instead, so that when things are going great for you, You don't get all high, and when things are going bad for you, you don't get all depressed. It's just, you know, it's all the same. And the poem goes on. Why then are miserable men in awe when tyrants rage impotently? That is, without power. If first you rid yourself of hope and fear, you have disarmed the tyrant's wrath. That is, if you don't respond in hope or fear, if you look at the tyrant, the ruler, and express neither hope in that person nor fear of that person, then what can that person do to you? Nothing. And we can extrapolate from this. We can extrapolate by saying the tyrant is anybody who does anything to you. So what do you do when you respond to somebody who does something that you consider bad or wrong to you? Give that person power over you. So when you stay angry at somebody, that anger is that other person's power and control over you. But if you don't get angry, if you respond with no response, who has power? You do. You have the control, right? But whosoever quakes in fear or hope, drifting in losing mastery, drifting like a piece of driftwood on the ocean. What does it do? It rises with the wave and it falls with the crest when the wave collapses. If you're like that piece of driftwood, then what happens? All throughout life, you're rising and falling. You're high, you're depressed. But instead, if you have mastery, if you have control, none of those external things affect you, okay? Similar to, for example, what St. Paul says in Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am, the highs, the lows, the good, the bad, the being beaten like St. Paul was many times, you know. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content, to be satisfied, to be at peace. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full, to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Okay? So, she says, do you understand this? Have my words penetrated your mind? And then she asserts, if you want the doctor's help, you must reveal the wound, right? You go to a doctor and you say, doctor, I'm in pain. What's the doctor going to ask? Where? If you don't tell him where, or her where, the doctor can't help diagnose your problem. The doctor can't help heal you. So if you really want help, if you want to be relieved of that pain, you've got to tell the doctor where it is. And that means what? You've got to confess what the problem is. Okay? Keep in mind, he's thoroughly Christian, but he's not using Christian terms anywhere throughout. People have actually suggested, well, Boethius isn't a Christian because he never refers to Christ in here. C.S. Lewis famously pointed out in his little book, The Discarded Image, well, the reason for that is because he's writing the consolation of philosophy. He's not writing the consolation of religion. If it were the consolation of religion, it would be entirely about Christ and the doctrines of the church. But he's not. He's writing about how philosophy can help console during times of problem. Philosophy not meaning simply reading ancient philosophers, but the love of wisdom, of pursuing wisdom, pursuing truth, pursuing goodness. All of those are what philosophy means, okay? So after she says that, if you want the doctor's help, you have to reveal the wound. He reveals the wound. What is it? Fortune. He says it's fortune. Fortune isn't constant. Why do sometimes I have, great fortune and other times I have bad fortune? And he says to philosophy, are my clothes the same, my face the same as when I used to probe the secrets of nature with you? Am I wearing the same clothes? Does my face look the same? And you should describe the various paths of the planets, blah, 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 blah. What's his point? You suck. Philosophy sucks. Philosophy didn't help me stay out of this situation. And he's implying his face is drawn, maybe a little thin. He's not eating the way he once was, right? He goes on. You took your cue from him, that is Plato, and said that the reason why it was necessary for philosophers to take part in government was to prevent the reins of government falling into the hands of wicked men, okay? So he just lets rip for several pages. He says, page 10, about a third of the way down. You and God, who has sowed you in the minds of wise men, are my witnesses that the only consideration to impel me to any office was a general desire for good. See, he didn't want these high powers, these high offices that he had. Theodora kind of plucked him out, made him do them. He wanted to be a simple scholar. As I said earlier, all he wanted to do was translate the works of Aristotle and Plato and write commentaries on them. He says, but I accepted these jobs, these high offices. Why? For a general desire to do good. That is, for the people of Rome, for the people of the Western Roman Empire, okay? Which can be scary when you think about it. Because generally, people who want to do good, they kind of think they know what the good is, and they know, therefore, what is good for you and for others, rather than leaving it up to you to determine what is good for you. C.S. Lewis, in an essay called The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment, published in the collection of essays called God in the Dock, says, good men consistently acting upon that position will act as cruelly and unjustly as the greatest tyrants. Okay? That position is doing good for others. Quote, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. Maybe we should replace the word victims with subjects. So, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its subjects may be the most oppressive. It may be better, quoting Lewis still, to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. Just think of the current pandemic. In the states that have these severe lockdowns. Well, why ostensibly, on the surface level, why are there the lockdowns? They're to protect people, right? They're to protect people from getting COVID. What do the people making the lockdowns assume on behalf of the people that they rule? That they can't make decisions for themselves about how best to prevent themselves from getting COVID. And yet other governors in other states that haven't done lockdowns have said, I trust the citizens of my state to make decisions for themselves that are best for them. And it's some of those states that have had the fewest number of disease. Mask wearing. We all hear mask wearing, oh, it's so important. It's going to solve all the problems. And yet there's not a single study that shows wearing masks prevents the spread of disease. In fact, there are studies that show wearing masks do not prevent the spread of influenza. Okay? Listen to Lewis again. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity, greed, may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. Think about this. There have been politicians, governors, leaders of countries who have said, we will not lift the lockdowns until the disease is defeated. That's illogical. That is ridiculous. The only way a disease is defeated is if you come up with a true vaccine. You know, the flu shot you can get every year. It's not a vaccine. It's not a true vaccine, like the polio vaccine, the measles vaccine, the mumps vaccine. Those are true vaccines because they make it impossible for you to get those diseases later. The flu vaccine, what? It's temporary. You got to get it every year. And even when you get it, the shot, chances are 30% of the time it won't be effective. Because there's a 70% chance, because there's a 30% chance it'll be the wrong kind of influenza strain that you're getting the vaccine for, okay? COVID is more than likely, it's going to be one of those temporary, you'll have to get it every year. So that means, does that mean we have the lockdown in perpetuity? We have to wear masks forever? Because some governors have said we're not going to lift the mask requirement until COVID is wiped. That's what Lewis is talking about in that passage. All right? So, back to Boethius. He says, I just wanted to do good for the people. This was the reason why I had no alternative, but grimly, to resist evil. And why in the struggle to defend justice, I've always been indifferent to the hatred I inspired in men who wielded greater power than me. And indifference, okay, so what he's talking about. I didn't care what the men who had power over me did. I was trying to do good for those who were beneath me, okay? He's mainly here griping that fortune didn't treat him fairly, okay? Page 11, the last sentence of that first long paragraph. Fortune should have blushed at the sight of innocence accused, his innocence, or at least the depravity of my accusers. So he's blaming fortune for not being fair to him in terms of morality. Here he was trying to do good, and instead he suffers evil. So he said, but you want to know the real problem? Here's the real problem. Bottom of page 11. I'm accused of having desired the safety of the Senate. Yeah. I did. Tell me what your advice is. Am I to deny the charge to avoid causing you philosophy shame? Fact is, I did desire the safety of the Senate, and I will never cease to. In other words, even if it increases the suffering, I will still defend the Senate. Top of page 12, should I count it a crime to have desired the safety of the Senate? Imprudence may deceive itself, but it cannot alter the true value of things. In the ruling of Socrates that it is quite wrong to assent to falsehood and conceal truth forbids me either to hide truth or be party to untruth. In other words, by appealing to Socrates, he's saying, I'm going to follow reason, wisdom, the good in all things, okay? He talks about forged letters, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see here. And he then says, bottom of page 12, he quotes Epicurus, refers to Epicurus. It may be part of human weakness to have evil wishes, but it is nothing short of monstrous that God should look on while every criminal is allowed to achieve his purpose against the innocent. It's important. What's his real problem? It's with God. What's he really saying? Okay, God, here I am. I'm trying to do what's right. I'm trying to do what's good. I'm trying to do what's moral. And you let these bad things happen to me. If this is so, that is, if God does look on while allowing criminals to achieve their purpose against the innocent, it was hardly without reason that one of your household asked where evil comes from if there is a God, and where good comes from if there isn't. Epicurus, your footnote tells you, essentially says, how can there be evil if there is a good, omnipotent God? Okay? How can evil exist? How can bad things happen to good people if God is omnipotent and God is omni-good? The flip side of that, Epicurus, if there is no God, where does goodness come from? Okay? Epicurus wasn't a Christian. So, he goes on. He's not done. Okay, she said, we have to find out the cause of your problem. What's he doing? He's letting it all out. This is his quote unquote confession. Okay? Top of page 13. Even supposing there may have been some justice in that the evil men who were out for the blood of all good men and of all the Senate also sought my own death when they saw me championing them, surely I did not deserve the same treatment from the Senate. He says, okay, maybe I can accept there were evil men who were out to get the Senate. And because I was defending the Senate, they're out to get me. I can understand. But why would the Senate side with them against me? That's totally not right. Okay? And then he says, end of that paragraph, page 13, for as often as a man receives the reward of fame for his boasting, the conscience that indulges in self-congratulation loses something of its secret merit. Its secret merit, what it has earned, so to speak, in God's eyes, okay, for what it has done rightly. Well, how does it lose some of that merit? Because it thinks, oh, I've acted righteously. See, that's not a humble thought. That's a proud thought. And by thinking I'm acting righteously, that diminishes the righteousness of the action. And now you see the outcome of my innocence. Instead of reward for true goodness, punishment for a crime I did not commit. I didn't do this thing and I'm being punished for it. Where is God? Okay? And he says towards the bottom of that paragraph, here I am, page 13, final paragraph. Here I am, 500 miles away, that is from his home, condemned to death, to have my property confiscated, silenced. I don't have a public voice anymore, and with no opportunity to offer defense. Why? All because of a somewhat too willing support of the Senate. That's it. All right. Page 14, and last sentence of the first big long paragraph. You know, it's always the unfortunate who are first to be deserted by the goodwill of men. Okay, are they deserted because they are unfortunate, or are they unfortunate because they're deserted? Okay. And then he says, in the next paragraph on page 14 to the paragraph at the top of page 15, he keeps using the phrase, I seem. I seem, I seem, I seem, I seem, I seem, I seem. Seem is a subjunctive verb. It indicates a condition contrary to fact. Okay? Like saying, here's an example. Donald Trump seems to be a very humble person. Well, that's a condition contrary to fact. No one would say that about Donald Trump. President Trump would not say that about himself. Okay, he's a braggart. He toots his own horn constantly. Right? I'm not making political judgment. So he says, I seem to see, I seem to see, I seem to see, I seem to see. Why does he use the I seem? What has philosophy already said about his sight? He sees dimly. He doesn't see clearly. He doesn't see properly. So it's his sight that sees these things, but he's not seeing properly. He is misseeing, in other words. And notice the things that he says he seems to see. I seem, bottom of page 14, to see the wicked haunts of criminals overflowing with happiness and joy. I see criminals prospering. I seem to see all the most desperate of men threatening new false denunciations. That is, the men in most danger, they're the ones throwing false accusations. I seem to see good men lying prostrate with fear at the danger I am in. That is, they're lying prostrate, lying flat on the ground with fear. And what he means is they're catatonic. They are not standing up to defend the good and the right and the true and the beautiful, etc. While all abandoned villains are encouraged to attempt every crime in the expectation of impunity. The law won't touch them. Here's an example. Again, I'm not talking about the rightness or wrongness of their political beliefs or anything, right? There's scores of articles during this election season talking about people who support Trump who are who are afraid to put bumper stickers on their cars or signs in their yards. Why? Because of people who are not supporters of Trump, who will, scratch their cars, pop their tires, let the air out, damage their cars, or who will remove the signs in their houses, egg their houses, do physical damage to their homes. Okay? So, he's talking about the good men lying prostrate, that is, unwilling to do anything. So assume for the moment the good men here, in my analogy, are the supporters of Trump, while the evil, the villainous, they're going out without impunity. That is, people who are destroying property and not worried about the police. Or take that example, move from the example I use to protests and riots. Take that back, not protests. Looting and riots, that we've seen all across the country this summer. People, just going into Target stores or Saks Fifth Avenue, etc., in New York, and taking everything and not afraid at all of the police doing anything. Okay? So I seem to see this, I seem to see this, I seem to see this, and I seem to see the innocent deprived of peace and safety and even of all chance of self-defense. What's his point again? It's unfair. Where is the fairness? Okay? Book 5 starts with a poem. Notice who the poem is about /to. Creator of the starry heavens, Lord on the everlasting throne, thy power turns the moving skies. Sky makes the stars move, and everything moves according to what we're going to talk about later. And we get down to page 16. About 5 lines down. Why else does slippery fortune change so much, and punishment more fit for crime oppress the innocent? Corrupted men sit throned on high by strange reversal, wickedness downtreads the necks of holy men. Bright virtue lies in dark eclipse by clouds obscured. An unjust men heap condemnation on the just. No punishment for perjury or lies adorned with speciousness. Right? They use their power when whimsy bids, willy-nilly, and love to subjugate great kings whose sway holds countless men in fear. O thou, going back to the first line, creator of all, O thou who bindest bonds of things, look down on all earth's wretchedness. Of this great work is man so mean apart by fortune to be tossed? So mean apart means so low, so insignificant as to be tossed about by fortune. Lord, hold the rushing waves in check, just as Christ, when he was on the ship on the Sea of Galilee, commanded the winds to be still, and they were still. That's why he uses that image. Hold the rushing waves in check, and with the bond thou rulest the stars. Make stable all the lands of the earth. Okay? The stars, he's saying, don't go out of their orbits. They follow your rule. But down here on earth, they don't. Down here on earth, everything is haphazard. Right? Throughout this long and noisy display of grief, philosophy remained unperturbed. Notice, it's noisy. What does he mean? It's like all these things that I have in my hand. It's cacophonous. It's not pleasant. It's not ordered. It's not harmonious sound. It's jangling. Okay? And when he finally finishes, she speaks. So philosophy finally gets a chance to respond. And she says, she saw your looks, saw that he was suffering. And she says, bottom of page 16, however, it is not simply a case of your having been banished far from your home. You have wandered away yourself. Or if you prefer to be thought of as having been banished, it is you yourself that have been the instrument of it. No one else could ever have done it. What does she mean? She's telling him, you think you've been removed from your home, but you haven't. You have removed yourself from your home. Okay? She's talking about two different homes. For if you remember the country you came from, it is not governed by majority rule like Athens of old, but if I may quote Homer, one is its lord and one its king. See, her point is, you've removed yourself from your true home, which is not Rome. It's elsewhere. She goes on and says, submitting to his governance, and the his is capitalized, God the Father, and obeying his laws is freedom. Okay? Paul says, I don't remember, and I did not look this one up. Paul says in one of his letters that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Okay? Submitting to his governance and obeying his laws is freedom. You seem to have forgotten the oldest law of your community. Okay? Now, she doesn't mean a community of Rome. She doesn't mean a community of scholars. She doesn't mean a community of writers. She means the body to which you really, truly belong. And this is the oldest law. That any man who is chosen to make his dwelling there has the sacred right never to be banished. So the question is, where is his real community? And think about what that word community means. C-O-M, means with, together, unity, living together, living with, in union. Okay? That is same beliefs, same practices, same outlook, sameness of heart. We're going to hear, didn't think about that. I don't have that book. There's a passage in the fourth Harry Potter book towards the end where this idea is addressed. Hold on just one second. So this idea of community. Towards the end, chapter 37, the beginning chapter in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Dumbledore says, every guest in this hall will be welcome back here at any time should they wish to come. I say to you all, once again, in the light of Lord Voldemort's return, we are only as strong as we are united, as weak as we are divided. Lord Voldemort's gift for spreading discord and enmity is very great. We can fight it only by showing an equally strong bond of friendship and trust. And this is the part I wanted to really get to. So, friendship, a strong bond of friendship and trust. Differences of habit and language are nothing at all if our aims are identical and our hearts are open. That's community. If we have the same goal and our hearts are open, meaning what? To one another. Okay? What did philosophy say? Any man who is chosen to make his dwelling there, what's the there? The home where one is its Lord and one its King, right? Has the sacred right never to be banished. That will forever be that person's home. So there can be no fear of exile for any man within its walls and moat. On the other hand, if anyone stops wanting to live there, he automatically stops deserving it. It's heaven. It's with God. If you want to take the religious notion of heaven out and just say with God, because God is a philosophical concept as well as a religious concept, okay, that's fine. It's home where God is. So she says, so I'm not going to talk about your appearance or your library or the decorations and all that. That's not important. What's important? The seat of your mind. That's what's important. That is the place where I want stored away. Not my books. Not my books. The books themselves, the physical, this. The physicality of the book, she says, is unimportant. But the thing that makes them have any value, the philosophy they contain, the meaning, the ideas, right? She says, so I need to get to your mind. Why? Because that's what used to contain these ideas. All right? So she goes on and talks about, services to the common good, blah, 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 blah. Go to page 18. In the end of that paragraph at the top of the page, it continued over from page 17, she says, in your final angry verses, that's the end of the poem that ends on page 16, you prayed that the same peace that rules in the heavens should rule on earth, right? Page 16, final 7 or 8 lines. O thou who bindest bonds of things, look down on all earth wretchedness. Of this great work is man so mean, apart by fortune to be tossed. Lord, holding the rushing waves in check, and with the bond thou rules the stars, make stable all the lands of earth. That is, make the earth as sure and firm and stable as the heavens are where you dwell. Well, the Lord's Prayer says what? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Make your will done on earth as it is in heaven. Okay? That's what she's talking about. You prayed for the same peace that rules in the heavens to rule also here on earth. Right? And she says, in your present state of mind, while this great tumult of emotion has fallen upon you, and you are torn this way and that by alternating fits of grief, wrath, and anguish, it's hardly time for the more powerful remedies. Well, what are the more powerful remedies? What we get in books 3, 4, and 5. So she says, we got to start easy with you. It's like starting a new exercise regimen. You wake up one morning and you decide, I want to run a marathon. You don't go out that day and run 26.2 miles. If you never run before, you go get up that day and you start by walking. And you build up, to where you can walk a mile. And then maybe you start running a few steps the next day. And after a period, literally, if that's how you begin, years, then you can run a marathon. So she says, we got to start you out on soft medicine. Okay? What's the medicine for? It is as if you had become swollen and calloused under the influence of these disturbing passions. And by their more gentle action, the medicines, they will temper you ready to receive the strength of a sharper medicine. Notice, she says, it's as if you'd become swollen and calloused. Well, that's the image almost of a blister. How does a blister form? Skin rubbing against something, and it swells and you get the pus in, but it's got to be lanced. You got to get the pus out. Or calloused by skin that's constantly used against something hard so that you get this thick part. Okay? Well, that's not the natural nature of skin. Skin's supposed to be soft and supple, right? Chapter 6 of this first book. And begins with a poem and go down to about the last 7 or 8 lines. For God has fixed the season's task, and each receives its own. Each season has its own job to do, etc. No power is free to disarray the order God has shown. Should then some being precipitate aspire to quit its place, should some being, some creature, some aspect of creation aspire to leave its set position, the Lord would not allow its success, its mutiny to grace. Well, that's the ultimate origin of the fall of mankind. What in Christian terms is called the fall, right? What is it? Satan said, according to Christian theology, I want to be like God. In fact, I want to be higher than God. And Satan, we are told, is the highest of the created order. He's the highest of the angelic beings. But in that Christian theology, God is up here and everything that's made is down here. Notice what's between this and this. There's a big gap. This is unmade, eternal, outside time, and everything here is made and eternal. It's within time. Satan is the highest of this. He's bumping up against this, but there's just still this gap. Now with my hands, it's a small gap. It's a huge gap. It's a gap that can't be bridged, so to speak, by anything down here trying to go up. So we're told the Lord would not allow success, its mutiny to grace, and what happened? Satan was thrown out of heaven. Okay? So, she asks Boethius a question. Do you mind if I ask you some questions? So I can figure out the best way to cure you. Like a doctor. Well, I got to do an exam. I got to figure out what the real source of your problem is. So do you mind if I do an exam? I'm going to have to touch you places and, knock on things and palpate things and listen to things. And he said, sure. Okay. And so she asked him a fairly simple question. Page 19. Do you believe that this life consists of haphazard and chance events, or do you think it is governed by some rational principle? I think I've mentioned before in here the movie Signs. M. Night Shyamalan, however you pronounce his name, where Mel Gibson plays the Episcopal priest and Joaquin Phoenix plays his younger brother Merrill. Well, that's the question. That's the question that's essentially being answered or being asked in that movie, because you have that scene when they're watching TV and they see the aliens on all the newscasts, and Mel Gibson, remember, is a lapsed, fallen, if you want, Episcopal priest, and Joaquin Phoenix is his brother, and they're watching TV, and Joaquin Phoenix is the character Merrill. He's trying to make sense. How can this be happening? How can aliens be taking over the world? And he asks Merrill, how can this happen? And Merrill says, there's two ways of looking at the world. Either everything happens according to a plan, according to an order, according to a reason, in which case everything has meaning and significance, and it's all going according to this plan, so there's nothing that happens by chance, or everything is totally haphazard, everything is totally random in chance. And he asks Merrill, does that help? He says, yeah. He says, I think there's got to be a meaning to it. There's got to be a reason why this happens. It's got to make sense. He's like, good. And Merrill asks his brother, which one do you believe? The former priest, or the priest who's no longer acting like a priest? And he says, Merrill, do you feel better? Have I brought you comfort? Have I given you consolation? He goes, oh yeah, I feel a lot better. Then what does it matter what I think? See, because Gibson's character doesn't believe that anymore. He doesn't believe in a good God who has ordered the universe. He thinks everything happens by chance. And it's because of what happened earlier that we only learn about later. And the thing that happened earlier that we learn about later is his wife was killed by a drunk driver. But she wasn't killed instantly. She was pinned against the tree. And he finds her, he sees her, and her last words to her aren't, oh honey, I love you, I'll wait for you in heaven, blah, blah, blah. Her last words to him are swing, Merrill, swing. Totally out of the blue, totally random. Well, we've come to find out Merrill had been a really good baseball player. In fact, he was going to the big leagues until he hurt his knee or something. Right? And he was at a ball game, and they're yelling, swing, Merrill, swing, because this was his shot. He was like on a minor league team. He was being looked at by the scouts, etc. So at some point in her life, she said, swing, Merrill, swing, And at the end of the film, Merrill's got a bet. There's an alien in their house. And Mel Gibson's character thinks of his wife's words. Swing, Merrill, swing. Okay? He's a good batter. And he beats the living, out of that alien. Random or ordered? Chance or significance? She goes on. Boethius replies, I could never believe that events of such regularity are due to the haphazards of chance. In fact, I know that God the Creator watches over his creation. This isn't a Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, benign watchmaker. God winds up the universe and throws it off into space and doesn't give a rat's, what about it? The day will never come that sees me abandon the truth of this belief. She says, good. Okay. End of that paragraph. Tell me then, since you have no doubts that the world is governed by God, what are the means by which you think he guides it? And he says, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. She says, I was right. That is, philosophy is telling us, I thought I knew what your problem was, but I wasn't sure, so I was going to ask some questions, but now I do know. Your mind has been infiltrated by the fever of emotional distraction. What does the word distraction mean? To be drawn away. Your mind, she's saying, has been drawn away. By what? Oh, look, something shiny. Oh, look, a bunny. Oh, look, you're ADHD, she's saying. You can't focus. Right? She says, but it's emotional distraction. It's the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. She said, do you remember what is the end and purpose of things and the goal to which the whole of nature is directed? What is the end and purpose? End there has two meanings. One of those meanings is, okay, one of those meanings is its completion, its final point, okay? The other meaning is its reason for being, and that's why she then says, and purpose. Its reason for being and purpose for having been made in the first place. So what is its reason and being and purpose for having been made in the first place? In the goal to which all of nature is directed. Why did God create the world? He says, I think I heard it once, but I don't remember. My memory has been blunted. What did she earlier say? You suffer amnesia. You don't remember who you are. Okay, do you know the source from which all things come? Well, yeah, God. God's the maker of everything, he says. Okay? Okay, this is obviously going to be more than one lecture because we're not even through book one yet. And we're going on an hour and a half. She says, okay, so top of page 20. How can it be then that you know the beginning of things, but you don't know their end? That is, you don't know their purpose, as well as conclusion. Okay? Do you remember you're a man? Yes. Okay, what is man? She asks him, page 20. Are you asking me if I know whether man is a rational, moral animal? Well, yeah. Any more than that? Is he only rational or moral? She says, are you sure you're not something more? Quite sure. She says, okay, now I know the other cause of your problem. First cause was you're distracted by your emotional state, passions. The other thing, and this is the major, that is you're forgetting, your amnesia, your distraction by the problems of your life. That's the minor problem. This one, this is your major problem. You have forgotten your true nature. What does the word nature mean? Your essence, not your atomic, your cellular makeup, but what you really are. It is because you were confused by loss of memory that you wept and claimed you had been banished and robbed of all your possessions. And it is because you don't know the end and purpose of things that you think the wicked and the criminal have power and happiness. And because you have forgotten the means by which the world is governed, you believe these ups and downs of fortune happen haphazardly. These are grave causes, and they lead not only to illness, but even death. Okay? But in your true belief about the world's government, that it is subject to divine reason and not the haphazards of chance, there lies your hope of rekindling your health. Why? Because what does he put at the heart of that government and creation? God. She says it is the accepted opinion that the nature of the mind is such that for every true belief it rejects, it assumes a false one. from the fog of distraction that rises to blot out its true insight. I will try to lessen this particular fog, little by little, applying gentle remedies of only medium strength. Think of his mind as a garage. She's got to clear out all the crap. Why? So he can park the car in. What's the car? His true understanding. His true self. She's got to remove all the junk. So, chapter 7 begins with a poem. And it ends with these 9 or 10 lines. If you desire, this is page 21, if you desire to look on truth and follow the path with unswerving course, that is, to look at truth up here and to follow the path from down here to up here. So here's where the path begins, and here's where truth ends. So you have to follow it with unswerving course. Rid yourself of joy and fear. Rid yourself of emotions. Put hope to flight and banish grief. Why? We're going to follow reason now. We're going to follow logic. The mind is clouded and bound in chains where these hold sway. What are these? Emotions. Hope is an emotion. Fear is an emotion. Joy is an emotion. Okay? We got to get rid of all the emotions. We got to follow cool, cold, hard reason. Book 2. I'll do a separate recording for that.